Hello, my name is Danielle Moody. I have paper 28 and 29, both written by Alexander Hamilton. 28 is the same subject continued, the idea of restraining the legislative authority in regards to common defense. And paper 28 is considering the milita. Both of these are, well, to start with, this is actually a continuation of 27, so it took a little bit of research on what that paper was about to really fully understand 28 and 29. Both of these papers, again, are addressing the idea of state versus federal military. So I guess the overarching idea with all three of these papers, and 28 and 29 specifically, is at that time, they did not want the federal government to have too much control. So it was this common idea of how do we get everybody on board with the idea of federal government without people feeling like all of their power is taken away. So you can understand how when we're talking about military and like forces, whether that's our current idea of military or like a standing milita, which is something that's addressed in these papers, just how you could feel like if the federal government has the military and that power and the states don't, how it really feels like they have all of the power. So Hamilton's really addressing why the federal government needs to have the military through these different sections. So in 28, he's really addressing the fact that states can't do it, but the necessary and proper clause is really what he's using in opposition, right, to them not having, or the federal government having power still, and the states thinking that if there's a military that only federal government controls, then it takes away, right? The power is not there. So one of the big things that he's talking through is the fact that checks and balances already exist. And the people get the say and who's in the government, so they shouldn't fear that the national government is going to be something they didn't want, because we set up this great system of how people will have their voice heard in the elected officials that they put in power, essentially. So the other big idea that Hamilton has is that if the states have a military and the state officials start abusing the power, then who is going to put them in check, right? Or is it just going to be a bunch of citizens that rally together to do it? And that doesn't really make sense. So it's if the federal government got out of balance or tried to abuse the power through having the military, the states would then put them in check by being able to form some sense of power, essentially. One thing I find really interesting that's not addressed necessarily in paper 28 and is very, very scarcely addressed in paper 29 is the fact that there isn't much about the states getting in conflict with each other. It's all about, the federal government to the state government. And I guess this is understandable because that's what the people's concern is at this time. And again, he's really addressing like worst case scenario here. He's not saying this would happen, but it's the opposition of why we should have it. And he's looking at this from like here, how it could go bad. So then when we think later down the line, right, the Civil War happens. This is happening beforehand. And how much worse it possibly could have been if the states all had their own military of some sort, of any sort, what could have happened in Civil War times, and I mean how bad it already was. So then we go into paper 29, and it's talking a little bit more about the need for uniformity. So one of the things that Hamilton addresses is how that's going to be done, and he's talking about the need to only meet once or twice per year, opposed to needing to meet more regularly. So we know now that the military is a full-time job, and it's transformed quite a bit from what he's speaking to. But he's just really talking about the need to address, again, uniformity, crisis control. So if there's something that happened in Alabama and they have this wonderful setup of a military of some sort, and then something else happened in maybe Tennessee and they have no military, it would be if the federal government had control over everything, they would still get equal resources to fix something regardless of how prepared. One thing I do really like that I think it's actually addressed in paper 29 is that it's in 29, is that he talks about the way that the state is not going to be able to afford to have a military. And we know things that have already been discussed in this course that really one of the big ways that the federal government can control states now is through this like carrot approach, and that they have money to invest in something. So they're like, well, we'll give you the money if you, do what we want, essentially. So I think it's funny that Hamilton is kind of addressing that in paper 29. And it also is something that we know is truth of how federal government can kind of, I don't want to say manipulate, but sway the states to do as they need. So that's kind of the general overview of these two papers.